I'm never above shameless self-promotion, mate. So all through the episode, I've been pimping out the show. But
good.
I think it's fantastic, even if I say so myself. But I love the history of the game. Had I not done the podcast myself, I want to hear all these sort of stories. So that's why the podcast came to be.
And you are in Australia right now.
You're talking NBA basketball. You're talking great teams. You're talking great individual players.
Takes it off, and there's number 23, and of course Johnny goes nuts.
So I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I just tried to go out there and play my game.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Adam. I don't like anybody. I'm not a people person.
Strand, you make the pass, yes. Christian, can you catch the ball? Yes.
All the stars were aligned and all the muscles fired at the right time, and I was able to get off the ground and throw one down.
I was saving that as a surprise for you.
And now, introducing your host for In All Airness, Adam Ryan.
Welcome to episode 118. Thanks for joining me. Today, for a change, I'm the guest. My friend Joseph Kaur, host of NBL Pocket Podcast, invited me on his show. We recorded this evergreen conversation in August of 2019. The episode was released on his podcast feed in early 2020. This is my edit of our hour-long episode that Joe released. Fans of my show may be interested to hear me mention a few guest episodes that have not yet come to fruition. We also discuss plenty of 1990s NBA topics. Joe's podcast is primarily focused on Australia's National Basketball League, the NBL. Our league has gained global recognition recently due to its Next Stars program, thanks in large part to current NBA rookies LaMelo Ball and RJ Hampton. Check out Joe's podcast if you haven't already. Search for NBL Pocket Podcast on your player of choice. I'm a fan of Joe's interviewing style. He is matter-of-fact, curious, and he asks great questions of his guests. Towards the end of the episode, I'll share perhaps the most inspiring podcast review I've received yet. If you can spare a moment or two, please add your review via your listening app. It'd be most appreciated. Show notes for this episode and access to a huge archive of past episodes are available at inallairness.com. Now, onto the show.
How long have you been doing the podcast for?
Started it, I think, in 2012, late 2012, so coming up on 7 years, thereabouts.
Who's your next guest you've got coming up or next episode idea?
I've got a few guys that are in the pipeline at the moment, but just getting them to commit is half the battle, especially when you just do this as a passion project. Some people have the mistaken belief that I get paid to do this. But I've got a few guys lined up. Rod Strickland is one that's I'm sort of circling around at the moment. I'm getting Dale Ellis back on the show to talk about the 1989 NBA All-Star Game because he had a monster performance in that, and that goes a bit under the radar. So he had about 27 points.
His whole career goes under the radar. He was most improved one year where he jumped from, 4 points to like a bona fide star, 25 or something like that. It was a great shooter, and he's really forgotten. Yeah, when he left Dallas, he went to Seattle and then became a star. Dale's been on the show previously, quite a few years ago now, but I reached out to him recently, and he's interested in doing sort of a watch-along of the 89 All-Star Game and commenting on what happened and different memories of players that he was playing with for that particular game. So I'm excited to do that. I've just got heaps of ideas. Yeah, hard to take from idea down onto paper, I suppose.
Yeah, but I've certainly got guys who have said, yeah, we'll chat, and it just doesn't come to fruition, or it takes a few reminders here and there. I don't want to be that guy that keeps on annoying somebody. So
it's the worst.
They're doing me the favour, so I try and just play it as cool as I can, and when the stars do align, then good things can happen. But I've got plenty of things in the works. It's just a matter of getting them recorded and going from there.
Here's where your investigative journalism skills coming. How do you, like a Rod Strickland, how do you find him? Do you just find him on Twitter and social and go for it, or another way that you kind of get in touch with people who are a bit more difficult to find?
Yeah, good question. Sometimes it's sort of networking. Some of the guys I've had on the show have been helpful in terms of connecting me with other guys, but most of them are accessible via social media one way or the other. Some of them are starting to branch out into Instagram now these days, and some are on Twitter, or even you do a Facebook search and you never know your luck. So I try and reach out to them that way. Occasionally I can find out some email addresses. LinkedIn's quite helpful as well. Jim McIlvain, who's a former guest on my show, has been very helpful. I mean, I haven't spoken to him since about 2014. As far as voice, when he was on my show, it became a 2-part episode because we talked for so long.
I've listened to some. Whenever I get a free moment, you're the first one I go to, but I've only listened to some, unfortunately. But sorry, Adam, keep going.
No, you're right. That's fine. But Jim's been very helpful behind the scenes, and even as recently as the last few weeks, he helped me connect with Paul Mokeski, the most recent guy I've had on the show, and he's a bit of a cult hero from the Milwaukee Bucks back in the 1980s. So you just never know how these things come to be. One night I got a message out of nowhere from Jim saying Paul would love to chat. He mentioned my show to him, and here's his details. And that's how that one came to be. Within 48 hours, I'm speaking to him. So then I just start going into the rabbit holes and the deep recesses of the internet and do some searches. I use a thing called newspapers.com.
Yes.
Which is excellent. It's a paid subscription, but you get some incredible details that way.
Someone's told me about newspapers.com as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's an archive of newspapers from mostly in America, but of course that's the perfect place for me to be able to actually search through. And you can just put in a person's name, you can narrow it down to a date range, put in some keywords, and it brings up all kinds of results. And then I use all that information and then put it into chronological order in a document on my end. And I just sort of worked my way through what the person did and achieved throughout their career. And that's how I use that as a basis for the conversation topics.
Because I got in touch with the guy, I hope his name is pronouncing it right, Seth Rosenthal. He does the young guy who does the ESPN beef history things for ESPN Nation or whatever it's called. I got in touch with him. I was like, where do you pull those little articles? You know how sometimes they'll have a headline and it's highlighted, Jordan hits the shot or whatever. I was like, how do you get that? And he goes, newspapers.com. And he goes, it's a really good encyclopedia, I suppose. And the fact that someone's archived all those newspapers, or at least a lot of them, that's an incredible amount of work. And congratulations to newspapers.com. That's amazing.
Yeah, well, I think it's about $70 per 6 months or something like that as a subscription. So it's definitely worth it. And I just find out so many intriguing bits of information that then sets up the basis of the conversations. And also you can get access to plenty of fantastic photos that appear in the papers from back in the day as well. So for example, with Paul Mokeski, I found just stacks of photos of him from back in his early days in playing for Kansas, and even a couple of high school photos. And
wow.
I send them on to those players.
And they haven't seen him, I bet.
No, that's right. They haven't seen him for years, if ever. And then they think, oh, wow, this guy seems legit. So it sort of helps them open up more because they know that I'm invested. So that's sort of how I sort of use it to my advantage. I love doing it as well. I just love the history of the game. So whenever I can find out more about these guys, then newspapers.com is a big way to go. But also just from what I've watched over the years, all the different games I've seen and the stories and things I've read in books and whatnot, all those things just are in my mind. Oh, I want to ask him about this. I want to ask him about that. And then I just put it into a document, get it into order of when it happened and, what unfolded, and go from there.
When you send that initial contact, because that's, I think, it's quite important, that first impression, when you send it, have you got an email that's, adam@inallairness.com and what's the phrasing of your request?
I use a Gmail address, so it's probably not the most professional thing going around, but it's inallairness@gmail.com.
Right.
Usually in the subject, I'll put something like NBA History Podcast, interview request, Adam in Australia, something like that. So normally I'd sort of state Australia in the subject because not often these guys are contacted by somebody who's in another continent.
International, yeah.
And then wants to talk about their career. So I usually would just make it a pretty brief contact to begin with. And if possible, I go through Basketball Reference and see who some of their teammates were over their journey. And if they've been a previous guest on my show, I mention them straight up and say, look, these guys have guested on my show. I'd love to do a deep dive in your career. Would you be interested in talking about your life in basketball? And usually I just leave it at that. I include a link to a couple of my previous conversations and just see how it goes. And often they just reply based on that and have a bit of interest, and then it sort of, all goes from there. But it's sometimes some guys are really responsive to it. Others you sort of never hear back from. There's some guys that sort of show interest and then they sort of, it wanes away and then you sort of chase them up a couple of months later. But yeah, I never want to try and push the issue too much.
Nah.
They're doing me the massive favour.
And also it's sometimes maybe your email's gone to the wrong place. Sometimes you take it personally when you don't get a response, but maybe they haven't even received it. You never know. But yeah, just for the people out there who are trying to get interviewed, that's a good way to do it, is to mention you from Australia. It's almost a little bit of cachet to say you're international. The title of your podcast, In All Airness, where did you come up with the title, or when did it strike you that was the one you wanted to go with?
Well, I wax and wane on this all the time because I'm not sure I even like the title, to be honest, but it's stuck.
It's quite esoteric. It's too clever, mate.
Oh, yes, too clever by half, as Dennis Cometti would say, the great Australian rules football commentator. I love wordplay and puns and silly things like that. And just, I was going through all kinds of ideas for what the topic, what it relates to and what I could possibly call the show. And I thought, in all fairness, and then I thought, oh, hang on, his nickname's Airness. In all airness, it's all about his airness. I don't know, I don't really love the name, but it's what I'm stuck with. It'd be too much trouble to rename it after all this time, 7 years down the track. And initially it was going to be all about Jordan, but it quickly became just about the history of the NBA.
Yes.
Of course, Jordan's a massive part of that, and a lot of the players and media and coaches I've chatted to are involved and have worked with or played against or whatever with Jordan, but it's so much more than just MJ. So unfortunately, the title sort of shoots me in the foot sometimes, but I do add Jordan era NBA history podcast or something like that in amongst the details of it on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, as it's now known.
I mean, I called mine, when I originally said it, I literally just wanted to call the podcast something so basically simple that you immediately thought. So I went to NBL Pocket Podcast because I wanted to do it in under an hour, but sometimes it goes longer than that. I actually wanted to do it about half an hour. So when you say you shot yourself in the foot, I know exactly what you mean, where I'm like, I wanted to keep this super, super sharp and tight, but sometimes you need that 45 minutes to an hour with certain guests. It just happens.
Some of my conversations go for well beyond an hour. It doesn't necessarily start out thinking I'm going to be chatting for 2 hours, like the Paul McKeskey, the most recent episode, almost 2 hours. I didn't know it was going to go for that long, but I had all his career sort of chronologically listed, and I thought, well, I'll ask about this and this, and I just kept on branching out from there. You just never know. But I didn't want to call it just NBA History Podcast because
too generic.
I wasn't sure of the legalities of it. I didn't know if I could just say it was called the NBA History Podcast.
Yes.
Because back when I started in 2012, there weren't a lot of podcasts around at that stage. I'm sure they were still in the tens of thousands, but I didn't want to just get booted off iTunes as it was then known because I just called it the NBA History Podcast. So you had to be a little bit clever in trying to change the name, but I think I was too clever by half.
My then question is, you're a big fan of the NBA and basketball and that, but what makes you decide, why a podcast? Why not a website with articles or a documentary? Why podcast and the way you've done it?
I love podcasts. Since about 2008, I think that was probably when I can recall listening to podcasts. One of the main ones I got back in the day, as most people who probably are listening to this, would be the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Yeah, sure.
I listened to that for quite a few years, and it only dawned on me in 2012. I mean, it's still fairly early, I guess, but not too early in the podcasting history. I think they began in about 2004, 2005. But I thought to myself, why don't I just start a podcast on my own? I love them so much, and I listen to them all the time. Nobody's really doing what I actually wanted to hear. That was another thing because I wanted to hear conversations with guys who played in the NBA back in the day. I still love the game today, but it just doesn't hold a candle to the pre-1998 era for me, and that's just my love and nostalgia for that period of time. So I thought, oh, well, I don't know how well I'll go, but I just want to start one myself and see what happens and try and get guys on the show that used to play in the NBA or the ABA back in the day or whatever it might be. And the first guest I ended up getting in touch with was Bill Wennington, who was, of course, a key member of the Bulls on their second title run in the 1990s.
And a proud Canadian as well. I have these patchy memories because obviously you know my age where I'm at with this thing, but I remember him having, for a while, I don't think it was in Australia, but certainly in the United States, he had his own McDonald's burger, and it was called the Beef Wennington, and it had... Is this true? Am I right when I say this?
Yeah, you're right. He did have the Beef Wennington. I think I briefly asked him about it in my chat with him.
Do you remember what he said?
I can't actually remember what he said, but I think he brought it up just in passing. But I think there's a couple of ads for it that still exist that are online. You can find if you do enough searching for it. But I think he really enjoyed just having it named after him. And it's quite amusing to look back on. But it's funny how these sort of things come to mind and still stay in the memory banks, 20, 30 years after the event.
For sure. Now, you said how you like the NBA sort of pre-98. Obviously, the podcast is called In All Airness, semi-centered around Jordan and the Bulls. My question is, what did you like about that particular time? Like you said, it was nostalgic, but is there anything you can really pinpoint as to what you loved about that time and indeed Jordan and the Bulls? Is there anything particular to you that you really enjoyed about those two things?
Definitely. Pre-98, that's obviously my sweet spot. when the Bulls won Game 6 in 1998 at Utah, that was my 23rd birthday exactly on June the 14th. That holds pretty special memories as well, just coincidentally with numbers. But 1989 was one of the first times that I recorded some NBA games on videotape here in Australia on ABC. Peter G was the guy that mostly hosted the NBA games that we used to get once a week on TV, and usually they were 2 or 3 weeks delayed, sometimes longer. But yeah, I used to record games on videotape. One of the first ones I ever recorded was Jordan's shot at Cleveland in 1989, Game 5 at Richfield Coliseum. I watched that game countless times over the following 5, 6, 7 years with my brother Luke, and we just wore that tape out. And then I'd also recorded stacks of other things around that time and began to just amass a collection of games that would build up over the next 10 years.
What was the NBA coverage like? Did the ABC just straight away throw to the NBA and it was American commentators and everything? Or was there a little bit of a fingerprint of the ABC on the game?
There was basically a quick intro from Peter G. He'd be wearing his famous green jacket, and most of the people old enough to remember would remember this.
I don't remember Peter G, but when you say green jacket, ABC Sports, I'm immediately thinking of The Late Show and Graham and the Colonel.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's right.
Is that a rip-off of him?
Oh, I don't know if it's a rip-off of Peter G, but I think it might have been some of the wardrobe choices of the ABC back at that time. I'm not entirely sure, but I definitely know you're talking about Rob Sitch and Sando Chilaro. They'd briefly have an intro with Peter G. He'd sort of introduce what game we're about to watch. It'd usually be a slightly edited version. I think they were 1 or 1.5 hours. And then it would cut straight to the NBA telecast as it happened on either TNT or TBS or whatever channel it was at the time. And then he'd sort of do an outro where he'd talk usually about what the game would be the following week and a couple of other key stats and things here and there. And it'd just usually be one game a week. On a Friday night, we get them on ABC, and then I think they replayed them pretty much every Saturday morning as well. But yeah, one of the first games was The Shot. I also recorded the 1989 NBA All-Star Game, which was a few months prior to that, and they were a couple of the early ones I kept on tape and just watched them over and over. Not too long after that, in the early 90s, the NBA card collecting craze kicked off, and my brother and I would just get cards after cards after cards, and we just studied the back of the cards, and that's how I learnt about a lot of the players. I'd get the Hoop magazine, Basketball Digest, all those sort of things, and that's when I really fell in love with the game. All throughout the 90s, I just became more and more obsessed, and that's why I think, just looking back, I just love that era so much because I can identify with it as when I first fell in love with it. So that's why I mostly focus on 1998 or earlier.
There's something about the basketball card, and they've kind of gone out of fashion. I think they're still around, but it's more of a real specific trade now. Before, like, everybody just had them. And I think when, now the NBA is consumed, online and in video, which is great, but there's, it's not as tangible as the actual physical little card. Like, you hold a bit of card, it's physically in your hand. You can't just click on it and it's gone the next minute. You got to find a home for it. I feel like that, it sounds a bit sort of conceptual, but that idea of that the NBA was in your hand growing up, it makes it a little bit more nostalgic. I don't know, maybe a bit much.
I definitely agree because I'd also just take pride in the fact that I'd learn all the names and nicknames of these players. I'd look at what college they attended, what numbers they wore, key stats, and even to this day there's certain players, as soon as I hear their name, I think, oh yeah, he went to that college, oh, he wore that number.
That type of graphic on the card or what have you, yeah. Did you have a brand that you liked? Were you an Upper Deck guy? Or?
No, I actually had the NBA hoops. I only really collected NBA hoops for just a couple of seasons. I don't know why I stopped. I had Fleer for a little while. I don't think I had many Upper Deck at all, but strangely I stopped sort of collecting them in there after a couple of seasons. But yeah, I had some very fond memories of just watching the collection grow and then just keep looking over and over and getting them all sorted and putting them into folders and all that sort of sad stuff. But I love doing it, so.
Let's talk about that 89 game, the shot. The way I remember it, and I watched probably a copy of it a couple of years ago, Craig Elo kind of has like one of the best, worst games in history. Like, he's actually going tick for tack. Like, he's doing a lot of scoring in the last couple of minutes, if I remember. It's not just a Jordan shoots a shot over a lame duck. Am I right when I say that?
Yeah, spot on. Craig had a great game. Him and Mark Price had fantastic games. They were both injured during that series. Coincidentally, a little shameless self-promotion, I'm never above that. Both guys, Craig Elo and Mark Price, have guested on my podcast. So I've chatted to them in some depth about this series. I'm not sure how much they wanted to talk about it, but I certainly asked them about it quite a bit.
It's an amazing series.
Oh, it's fantastic. I absolutely love it.
Jordan says he's going to win it 4. They take long. He misses free throws.
Elo had a great game, and if it actually wasn't for Jordan making that final shot over the outstretched arms of Elo as he sort of sailed past and Jordan just hung that extra half second, it seemed, Elo would have been the hero of the game because he hit the shot that put Cleveland up by one that preceded Jordan's final shot. Yeah, lots of great things from that series. It went to the fifth game. Chicago were the underdogs. They were the lowest seed, actually. And Cleveland had beaten the Bulls, I think, 6 times straight through the regular season. The rest is history, I guess, in terms of the shot. But it was a fantastic game. Elo had a great game, and so did Mark Price.
I'm always interested in guys who play like really good runner-up games, you know? And that is one that stands out, Craig Elo against Jordan. The other one is like Dikembe Mutombo against Shaq in that series. It's 2001, where Shaq has an incredible series, dominates. Mutombo actually plays really well, but you wouldn't know it. When greatness gets eclipsed, it's an interesting little thing, you know, and that was certainly one of them. Have you seen the footage of that 89 after the shot where it's done from the local Chicago news reporters, guys, and they run on the court? Have you seen that?
Absolutely, mate.
How amazing is that footage? Where he's grabbing Jordan and asks the question.
Yeah, and then the CBS guys are sort of trying to push him away as James Brown's trying to get the main interview with him. But yeah, he's going, yeah, you stuck it, Michael, you stuck it.
Jordan gives a very human answer. Normally very camera-ready Jordan, not so camera-ready in that moment. And then he sharpens up for the national TV. It's really incredible footage.
Yeah, it's rather primal, I guess you could say, his reaction, and certainly the two Chicago guys. One was the guy actually recording it on the camera. The other guy was the reporter as such. I'm just trying to think who the guy's name was.
You haven't spoken to him?
No, I've got in touch with the guy that filmed the actual angle that you're talking about, and I know of the name of the guy who's escaping me at the moment, but another guy from Chicago was there, Rich King. He's in the background as well on the baseline, and you can see him watching the shot as it happens on one of the angles of the photo of Jordan's shot. But yeah, I've got in touch with them, but to this point haven't managed to lure them onto the show, but I'll keep at it, mate.
What's your relationship with like the Chicago Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune? Do you kind of have any contact with them? Who's their Adam Ryan equivalent? Who's like their best Bulls contact from that era? Do you know who it is?
I've spoken to a couple of the great ones. Sam Smith.
He writes for the Tribune, or did.
Yeah, he's probably the preeminent guy that most people sort of jump to immediately when you think of the Bulls. He still covers the Bulls to this day, but for Bulls.com mostly. At that time, Sam Smith was definitely there. I think Lacey Banks is the name of another guy that was certainly involved back at the time. And I've also had a lady on the show, Cheryl Ray Stout, who is a Chicago radio pioneer and one of the first women to be involved in the coverage of the Bulls back in that era as well. She broke some unbelievable stories about Jordan, and I've had her on the show, and she opened up about how the story of Jordan's comeback in 1995 actually came to be. She was one of the first to actually hear the news of Jordan's impending return, which is overlooked quite a bit. And also she broke the story of him actually first leaving the game as well. So aside from Sam Smith, who's actually guested on the show a couple of times too, he wrote the Jordan Rules book, of course.
Second Coming. And one recently, which I haven't read. What's the title of that one?
It's the one about the labour negotiations, and for the life of me, I can't think of what it was. Prior to that, he had one called There Is No Next, which was another thing about Jordan.
There Is No Next. That's the one I actually meant. So
he's written another one since then, which was about the labour negotiations that led to the players getting, the exorbitant money they're getting today in the NBA. I can't think of what that one's called. But yeah, so they're a couple of the main ones. The other guys that we reference, another great mate of mine, Aaron Steen, who's the co-host with me on the series that I do called NB, whatever it might be. NB 88 is the series that we're doing at the moment, which is covering the 88 season as it unfolded. We reference a guy called Bob Sakamoto. He was another guy that wrote a lot of great pieces on the Bulls. I don't think the Sun-Times is accessible via newspapers.com. We've accessed the Chicago Tribune to a great degree because we got a lot of our great information on that series where we cover the season as it unfolds through the Tribune archives.
What about Jordan and the Bulls particular? Like, obviously, an amazing player and everything, but is there anything about them that's particular to you that you liked and thought about running with this idea of a podcast that's through their prism?
Well, one of the unheralded players that I absolutely love is Dave Corzine, and he was on the Bulls in the 1989 season. That was his last season with Chicago. An interesting little stat about him, he played the most games for the Chicago Bulls in the 1980s. It's a great trivia question that probably nobody would actually get correct. But he was on that roster and played in the game at Cleveland, Game 5 in 89. And as soon as I saw him, I was just became transfixed by him, thinking, who is this guy? What's he on the roster and what's his history? And then when I got his basketball card, I sort of studied a bit more about him, and I've always been fascinated by him. And the reason that the podcast, I think, has spawned into what it has become is I love hearing the stories of guys who are not the most well-known on a roster.
Sure.
It's great to have somebody who's really high profile and was an all-star or a Hall of Famer, don't get me wrong, but it's just awesome to hear the story of someone who never really had the spotlight shine on them throughout their NBA career, to at least to the degree that these other stars do, but they often have the most interesting stories and experiences that are hardly ever actually touched on or elaborated on. So that's why I thought, well, I'll create the website. I initially started doing a few blog posts here and there, but it quickly transformed to be just really a podcast, and I wanted to just hear these guys' stories and just sort of uncover the things that they achieved, because they're still one of the top 200, 300, 400 players in the world.
Yeah.
And yet people still talk down and say, oh, these guys are just, white stiffs or whatever, and it just annoys me so much. But I thought I want to share their stories, and often they got the most interesting ones that very rarely ever hear.
We were talking about Sam Smith and books before. Have you got a favourite NBA book? Is it Bill Simmons' Book of Basketball? Or
I do have the Book of Basketball. There's a lot of ones I've got on my shelf that I haven't actually even got to read yet.
Which ones haven't you read yet?
There's a great one that I'm hearing plenty of good things about called The Last Pass. It's written by, I think, Gary Pomerantz. It's about Bob Cousy and Bill Russell's relationship and their journey. It's only come out, I think, in the last sort of 6 to 12 months. But, The Last Pass, definitely have a look at that. I'm just going to turn around and look at my bookshelf for a minute.
Work away.
Michael Jordan, The Life is a fantastic book written by Roland Lazenby.
I've avoided that because I've thought, what could I possibly not know at this point? I've read Sam Smith's one. What's good about that one that you like?
Well, it's an absolute tome to begin with. It's massive. It's like 600-700 pages, something like that.
Yeah.
He dives into the Jordan family background and goes back a couple of generations, establishing how Jordan's maniacal side on the court came to be based on perhaps some of the generations before him and what they did in the early years before Michael was even a twinkle in his dad's eye, as they say.
Wow.
Yeah, a really insightful look, and it's a massive deep dive on Jordan's life. Roland Lazenby's a fantastic author. Hopefully I'll have him on the show at some stage in the future. I actually sent him a couple of Jordan game DVDs in advance of him writing that book.
Oh.
He very kindly put my name in the acknowledgements, which was fantastic.
Get out of here. I'm going to go into the nearest bookstore and check it out, for sure, because I've seen it there. I'll give it a second look.
He also is responsible for another great book. One of my other favourites I've got is called And Now Your Chicago Bulls. I think it was a 30-year anniversary book at the time. I got it for my 21st birthday from a really close friend of mine. A pictorial book, but also Roland Lazenby does the words as well to do with the history of the Bulls franchise. And there's some fantastic photos and stories about some of the key moments and players over the journey to that point with the Chicago Bulls.
This is both a confession and a brag, I suppose, but my high school library had a copy of Three-Peat Repeat, which was a sort of almost A3, large-sized book, photo journal of the 98 series against Utah. And I remember thinking, this is terrible, but I said, I don't trust this library to take as much care of this book as I will, and I stole it. Anyway, that's my high school library. Sorry about that. I just thought, no. I know I'll take better care of it, because I remember reading it and there was a bit of pen mark in it and stuff, and I was like, no, I can't have that. So I took it.
You're saying it's unacceptable that it's pen mark. It's coming home with me.
It was real crafty. I stole the barcode off it and everything. I felt at the time strongly that it had to be done.
Oh, that is so good. Well done. Congratulations on that, retrospectively.
Jordan Rules and Second Coming stand out. Also because they tell a great story, but also because of the investigative journalism involved. Like Sam Smith is sort of a brilliant writer in that respect of really telling a really unpopular story, certainly with Jordan, and risked a lot in printing kind of that book. I wouldn't say it was negative. It was deeply honest and, portrays Phil Jackson in a certain light, Doug Collins in a certain light, Jordan himself. I haven't actually listened to your interview with Sam yet. What was your impression of him writing that book and that book in general?
The book was eye-opening, to say the least, and it certainly provided me with a few questions for future guests. For example, I had Bill Cartwright on the show, starting center for the Bulls back in the late 80s and into the early 90s, of course. He won 3 titles with Chicago. In that, Jordan said something along the lines of,
don't pass him the ball.
Yeah, don't pass to Bill. And I asked Bill about that, and he gave me quite an honest answer back as well. Sam Smith's book was certainly transcendent at the time. We're talking pre-internet, so what was in the book, obviously, it certainly became massive talking points at that stage when it was released, and of course all through the papers, and probably soured his relationship, I guess, with Jordan to an extent too. And
when you're covering the Bulls, that makes it difficult.
Would make it very difficult. Back when I had Sam on the show the first time, I think it was like in the first 10 to 15 episodes he was on. So the first 20 or so episodes of my show, my audio quality is absolutely terrible. I'm talking into a web camera. The microphone was shocking, but thankfully the guest side of things, their audio is pretty good because it's usually Skype or it may have been a phone call quality, but still they sound pretty good where I sound terrible. But it was early days. I still took pride in the research I did at that time, but I'd love to get Sam back on the show again, talk to some more specific points again to do with those Bulls back in that era. But I found him to be really a great guy to chat with. He was very accommodating, and once I sort of reached out to him back at that time, might have been 2013 or something like that, he responded really quickly, and within probably 3 or 4 days we were chatting. And then he came back on again probably 3 or 4 years later when the new book he put out, There Is No Next, and then my mate Aaron and myself, we chatted with him in like a 3-man weave, chatting about that book as well, and he was really good at talking about the process behind how that book came to be and his research and interviews he did in the lead up to putting out that book about whether or not there will be another MJ.
That's always the question. I hate to even go down that road because you see enough of that sort of talk on Facebook about who's better and that. It drives you nuts. We won't go there.
No.
Who was that first guest who you were starstruck and nervous about calling?
I get a bit nervous before every call. As soon as I hear the Skype line ringing, I think, oh boy, what am I doing? Oh no, I'm freaking out. The very first episode was Bill Wennington, right? And I've said this a couple of times, but it was a funny way that it even came to be. Do you want the story very quickly?
Yeah, go. Yeah, please.
Okay. There's an app on the phone called Words with Friends, and I'm not sure if you've played it. It's like Scrabble, I guess. But at some stage, Bill Wennington on Twitter put a comment about his Words with Friends score or something like that. It mentioned his username at the time. I think I was already playing the game on the app, but I added him as an opponent and then messaged him behind the scenes and said, is this really the Bill Wennington? And then we were playing a few games back and forwards, and then he replied and said, yes, it is, and if it's not, my whole life has been a lie. So I thought, oh, okay, that's quite interesting. So he's got a sense of humour. We were going back and forwards playing this game, and then I thought, well, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. I'm in communication here with Bill Wennington. If this is really him, why don't I try and set up a chat with him? So I said something like, this is all via a message behind the scenes in the game. On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you sit in terms of chatting with me via Skype about your career when I start a new NBA history podcast? And he replied with, I think, 5. So I thought, oh, okay, well, he doesn't absolutely despise me.
It's a maybe.
It's a maybe. That's it. He doesn't despise me, yet he's not saying, oh, yeah, sure, let's do it. So I thought, okay, well, we'll just continue playing this game back and forwards. And then after a few months, I started doing my research on him. I came up with all the ideas of questions I'd like to ask him and topics I'd like to chat about, and then said, would you like to make this happen? And it happened in the off season between, I guess, before the 2012-2013 season began. And fast forward to when the call was about to happen, it was late at night here in Australia, so probably early-ish morning over there. And he answered the Skype call, and he answered it in video. So all of a sudden, he's on the screen in front of me. It's the first time I'm doing a podcast recording, and Bill Wennington pops up on the screen in front of me, and I am freaking out.
Oh.
But I was just beside myself thinking, my goodness, this is Bill Wennington, a guy that I've admired. He's an NBA champion.
Yeah.
A guy that I've followed for the last 20-odd years. I've known who he is and what he's done and his impression on the city of Chicago. And he's there right in front of me talking, and that was the very first person I had on the show, and he fired up the old video, and I was a bit frightened, to be honest.
Yeah, the video does throw me off as well. If you're talking with someone internationally, you're either doing it late at night or early in the morning. Not exactly camera ready. So.
That's right.
I think I saw on your Twitter the other day you had that amazing shot on the cover of Come Fly With Me. First of all, tell me, what's your favorite NBA entertainment video? And then specifically your favorite Jordan NBA entertainment, because there's a plethora out there.
There is. They've got some fantastic releases. My favorite would have to be Come Fly With Me.
Same.
Watched it so often, it was crazy.
The music, okay, can I quickly jump in there?
Please.
There's a guy on YouTube, his name is Jose, and he's got a very unique surname, terrestrial or something like that. He's got all the clean audio from NBA music. I mean, everything. So all the songs from Come Fly With Me, totally clean. No voiceover, not taped off the TV.
I've heard him.
You've seen it? It's amazing. I've saved them all. I walk down the street listening to that stuff half the time.
That's funny. That actually reminds me. At one stage, when I was driving to and from my job, I was a primary school teacher or elementary school teacher for about 6 years. And I don't teach currently. I'm just out of the teaching game. But I used to record the audio from NBA games onto CDs back in the day. I'd play the audio of games, so it'd be like, Marv Albert and Mike Fratello calling a Bulls-Cavaliers game or whatever it might have been. And I was listening to that on the way to and from work, so it's quite sad.
And listen to it like a radio call. That's a good idea, actually. That's awesome. Amazing. But yeah, Come Fly With Me. What about just NBA in general? Were you a Dazzling Dunks basketball bloopers guy, or do you have something else you like?
We had Dazzling Dunks and basketball bloopers. We used to watch that relentlessly as well. And I made my brother initially watch it with me, and then he came to love it as much as I did. Then there was the all-new Dazzling Dunks and basketball bloopers. It was just so good to see Frank Layden and Marv Albert and their humour going back and forwards in amongst all these NBA highlights and music clips as well. So NBA Superstars is another fantastic one.
Yeah, that was amazing. The one with Pearl Jam, I think. They were spectacular.
And then I was fortunate enough to have Don Sperling, who's the head of NBA Entertainment.
You see that name on the back of the videos.
Don talks about the part where he's chatting to, I think it's MJ's high school coach, and he says something along the lines of, yes, I'm the guy that cut Michael Jordan from his high school team, or whatever the words are. But in order for him to finally get that clip on Come Fly With Me, he basically said to him, look, if you don't say pretty much these exact words, I can't put it in the clip. So he then got the guy to say it, and that's the only words you hear from that coach. And it's basically because Don said, you must say it like this or you won't be on the show. I thought that was pretty funny. He elaborated on that in our episode.
I've watched that enough, but I've never been able to really put my finger on what made those so good. And they were all really good. Come Fly With Me was my favorite, but Airtime's amazing and Untouchables, all that sort of stuff. I still haven't quite worked out what they did that was so special, but amazing. Let's think about Jordan now. Obviously, was very lucky to be the type of player he was. I really do believe he was once in a generation and unreplicatable. I think that's probably pretty fair. But now, like, with the social media that goes on, like, has his legacy kind of been torn down and just he's been made a bit of a mockery of, like his crying face is on a lot of internet stuff. What is your relationship with Jordan now that he's with the Hornets?
I'm still a massive fan, still love following whatever he gets up to, and anytime he gets some camera time, wherever he is, I love seeing it and seeing what he's doing. He's been made a bit of a fool via these crying Jordan things, which I just despise, but that's another whole thing in itself. But I'm glad for him that he actually didn't have to experience any of the social media era as a player, because I've heard him on record say in interviews countless times that he wouldn't have been able to probably perform the way he did if there was the entire scrutiny of social media where you can't do anything without somebody filming you or hearing about it. I'm glad that he missed that whole era as a player. These days, yeah, he's getting criticism for the fact that he's not a great owner and he doesn't make the right moves and whatnot.
Lampooned is probably the word I'd use. It's that sort of point and laugh type thing, which is certainly there's criticism of him and the team he's run and whatever, but it's that joking style that I dislike.
It is. It's pretty much some tall poppy syndrome going on, and he's doing whatever he can and putting a lot of money into it at the same time. But, I mean, he's got his finger in about 35 different pies, and, of course, he's earning millions and millions every year as it goes. But I would have loved to have seen him actually enter into commentary, cover games, and be a sort of a special comments person. It would have been great to see what he would have done had he gone into the media side of things.
Let's go to the year he's not there. 93, 94, and then 94, 95, half of that season. Am I right when I say that?
Spot on, yeah. 1994, interestingly, I was on an NBA tour with some other Australians. We flew over to LA and then we watched about 6 or 7 games in about 2 weeks across the country. When we paid the deposit for that trip, Jordan was still an active NBA player.
Oh, no.
It was probably 3 or 4 weeks, I think, after the deposit was paid for the trip that Jordan actually ended up retiring.
Brutal.
Due to the tragic death of his dad. I was just beside myself, and I was about 19, I guess, at the time. And I was absolutely livid because the Bulls game was going to be one of the highlights of the trip.
Yeah, of course.
We get over there, we see 6 or 7 games. We get to Chicago. We saw the Bulls play the 76ers. It was Sean Bradley's rookie season with the 76ers, and I love Sean Bradley. The Bulls won in a massive blowout, but it was already terrible because Jordan had retired. So we didn't get to see Jordan play, but we get to see Pippen play, and we saw some other great players in the NBA at that time. So it was great to be in the old Chicago Stadium. But I really loved that season because, first of all, I was over there and saw some games during that time. Pippen had an absolute ripper of a season, MVP quality season. Won the All-Star game, MVP as well in 94. So he was on fire that season, but sadly missed out on seeing Jordan. So I've got quite a strong attachment to that season regardless, even though Jordan was in retirement.
The lineup would have been B.J. Armstrong, Pippen, Horace Grant, and still Will Perdue. I don't think he was traded at that point. And your starting shooting guard would have been what? Pete Myers.
He actually played for the Bulls back in the maybe 87 season. When he was a youngster, he was on the Bulls roster. Then he came back and was pretty much the guy that was tasked with replacing Michael Jordan.
They hadn't pulled the trade on Rodman yet. They still had Will Perdue.
Rodman came over, I think, in October of 95 is when he joined the team, when they got rid of Perdue just prior to the 95-96 season kicking off.
And if you look at that 94-95, that season and a half in the absence of Jordan, it really shows how good Pippen was. But have you ever looked into like the Pete Myers situation, like what it was like being that guy?
I'm not sure what his current role is, but he certainly was with the Bulls fairly recently. He had obviously a lot of expectation on him, and you're never ever going to replace a Michael Jordan. But yeah, it's quite an interesting period of time for him.
That season's not spoken about. The other thing that's kind of a bit buried is the series against Orlando. Now, you remember you put up footage and then it got taken down, am I right?
That's right.
Okay. So that's what I want to talk about. That series, why do you think it's kind of buried? You're going to have to tell me because I haven't seen it since I was 8 years old. What happened in that series? Tell me about it.
That's funny because I uploaded, I think it was game 4 of the Bulls Magic series, and that was taken down.
You sent it to me, and it was down within 12 hours, which is quick.
Somehow game 6 still stays on there. And I think I uploaded another game earlier in the series, which is still on there. But strangely, it's a series that's often forgotten. Of course, Jordan was wearing 45 after game 1 of that series. Nick Anderson questioned that Jordan, had he been his old number 23, that wouldn't have happened. And of course, come game 2, Jordan had an absolute ripper of a game and reverted back to his famous number 23. So there's heaps of different storylines throughout that series. Chicago definitely should have won the series. They just gave it away, unfortunately. I guess they were still trying to gel together as a team. People sort of say, the NBA wants people to forget about it, but I think that's far from the truth. It's just a strange moment in time where the Bulls hadn't yet quite gelled. They had to make some more moves. They got rid of Perdue. They brought in Rodman. It'd be fascinating to sort of see more of a deep dive into that. But for the time being, I guess we can only imagine what could have been, but quite fascinating to watch when you look back on it all these years down.
When you say they gave it away, what do you mean? Like, did they miss late shots? Was Jordan not good? You talked about not gelling, but is there any game in particular where they didn't play so well?
Game 6, we're talking about 1995 NBA playoffs, Bulls Magic. It was played in Chicago, and with 3 minutes and 24 seconds left in the fourth quarter, Chicago were leading 102-94, and they end up losing that game at home to the Magic. It's hard to even imagine that's the case. The final score was 108-102. So Chicago didn't score again for the last 3 minutes and 24 seconds. That's the decider at Chicago. I just can't believe it. The Bulls let that one slip. Sure, they would have had to go back to play a game 7 in Orlando. They were up 8 at home with 3 minutes left and lost the game.
With Jordan.
There was opportunities throughout the series where the Bulls could have been up an extra game and actually could have closed it out in game 6 rather than actually being closed out in game 6.
I don't have any other questions for you. I'm very happy with the way that went. I'll speak again soon sometime.
Thanks very much, mate. It's been a pleasure chatting to you as well. Thanks for listening. I welcome your interaction with the show. You can suggest topics or guests you want to hear conversations with. Send me an email. Audio clips are welcome. inallairness@gmail.com. Time to share another great review from a fan of the show. Thanks to Traveling Truth Seeker via Apple Podcasts USA. It's titled Podcast That Saved 2020 for Me. It's rated 5 stars, thank you, and it reads, as wild as the year 2020 was, I found this podcast on Spotify and started binging the episodes. Since I couldn't give it a review there, here I am. I grew up in the 90s, and to be able to relive memories like this is amazing. Truly an astoundingly researched and entertaining podcast. This show is a gem. Now, I promise you I did not write that myself. I couldn't even pay somebody to write something as great as that. Thank you, Traveling Truth Seeker. I'm sure that's not your real name. I really appreciate the support. I'd love for you to reach out and actually let me know where you're based in the USA and perhaps a few details about you. Thanks so much for the very kind words. Worldwide, the show has 179 ratings on Apple Podcasts with an average of 4.5 stars, with 93 reviews across all providers. Thanks for your continued support. If you add a review, I'd love to read it out on a future episode. Your ratings and reviews are one of the best ways to support the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please tell your basketball-loving friends about it. Your word-of-mouth recommendations are truly worth their weight in gold. Stay up to date with my podcast and subscribe to my free email newsletter. You'll receive exclusive details on upcoming podcast episodes, future guests to appear on the show, and more. Simply email me inallairness@gmail.com. You can follow my show in various ways. Search for In All Airness, 3 words, on your podcast app of choice. The show is readily available on most listening platforms. Check the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with a great range of guests. Follow me on social media. My handle on Instagram and Twitter is @InAllAirness. Search In All Airness on Facebook and YouTube too. Join me next time for another edition of the show.